The summer sun hung heavy over the sprawling plains of the west, painting the horizon with hues of gold and amber. In the grand halls of the Windermere estate, Lady Isabella Thornfield paced nervously, the velvet of her gown brushing against the polished oak floor. She was a woman of considerable size, her frame commanding attention wherever she went, yet in the eyes of her father, the proud and ruthless Lord Thornfield, she was a source of constant disappointment. He had built his fortune on reputation and appearances, and in his rigid world, Isabella's girth was a mark of shame rather than of strength. Lord Thornfield's study door swung open, and Isabella froze as the heavy tread of his boots approached. His face was stern, carved with lines of age and authority, eyes sharp as an eagle's. "Isabella," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "you have shamed this family long enough." The words fell like stones, each syllable weighted with judgment. Isabella's heart thudded painfully against her chest, and she lowered her gaze, knowing resistance was futile. For as long as she could remember, Isabella had been trapped between her own desires and the suffocating expectations of her lineage. She had been promised for marriage to wealthy men, men who sought titles and estates rather than the woman herself. Each suitor had found her too large, too bold, too unworthy. The whispers in town and the icy glances at gatherings had etched themselves into her very soul. And now her father's solution was more cruel than she could have imagined. "You will leave this house," Lord Thornfield continued, "and you will be delivered to the Apache named Dakota. He will take you beyond the safety of these lands, where you will live among those who understand strength differently than we do. Perhaps then you will learn humility." His words struck Isabella like a thunderclap. To be handed over as punishment, to be treated as property rather than a daughter, ignited a fire of indignation and fear within her. She opened her mouth to protest, but no sound came. Dakota was a man whose name was whispered in the settlements like a legend. A warrior of the Apache, fierce yet fair, his presence commanded respect and caution. Stories spoke of his courage and honor, of the way he moved with the land as though it were part of him. Yet in the fear-laden imagination of Isabella, he was a figure both terrifying and enigmatic, a world apart from the luxury and order she had known all her life. The carriage ride from the Windermere estate was long and unforgiving. Isabella sat stiffly, gripping the edges of her cloak as the wheels rattled over dusty roads. The townspeople had gathered at the edges of the main street, their eyes flicking with curiosity and barely concealed judgment. Mothers tugged their children away, men lowered their heads, unsure whether to pity or gawk. Isabella felt the sting of humiliation sharper than the sun beating down upon her back. As the carriage drew near the borderlands, the air changed. The scent of wild sage and earth replaced the faint perfume of roses that lingered in her home. The landscape opened into rolling hills, dotted with tall grasses that whispered in the wind. Here, civilization felt distant, almost unreal, and Isabella's heart pounded with a mix of fear and wonder. She had never been beyond the walls of her father's estate, never known the vastness of the untamed land, never imagined what lay outside the confines of her gilded cage. It was at the edge of a shallow river that she first saw him. Dakota stood tall, his silhouette framed by the setting sun. His hair fell in dark, tangled waves over broad shoulders, eyes sharp and penetrating, yet not unkind. The bow slung across his back, and the quiet confidence in his stance spoke of a man attuned to the rhythms of the world, a hunter, a protector, and perhaps something more that Isabella could not yet name. "You are Isabella Thornfield," he said, his voice deep and calm, carrying the weight of command yet touched with curiosity. There was no malice, no judgment, only recognition and an understanding that surprised her. In that moment, Isabella realized she was not facing a monster or a captor, but a man who saw her hand. The thought both unsettled and intrigued her. The journey into the Apache lands was arduous. Days blended into nights, and Isabella's world shrank to the rhythmic motion of travel and the quiet presence of Dakota. He did not speak often, yet when he did, his words carried lessons hidden beneath simple statements about survival, respect, and honor. Slowly, Isabella began to see beyond the walls of her upbringing, beyond the cruel standards imposed by her father, and into a world where strength was measured not by appearances, but by courage, loyalty, and heart. One evening, As they made camp beside a flickering fire, Isabella watched Tokuda tend to the small flames with precision. The orange glow highlighted the angles of his face, casting him in a light she had never seen any man illuminated in before. Fear began to mingle with fascination, and fascination with something resembling trust. He glanced at her, catching her gaze, and for a moment the weight of her father's condemnation seemed distant, irrelevant. Yet, even as she felt the stirrings of a new life, a new possibility, the shadows of uncertainty loomed. Would she ever be accepted by this land and its people? Could a noblewoman, rejected and humiliated, truly find a place among those whose values were so different? And more pressing, could she ever imagine herself loved by the very man her father had cast her upon like a punishment? The nights were long, filled with the sounds of the wild that both terrified and awed her. Wolves howled in the distance, and the wind carried whispers through the tall grasses, as if the land itself were speaking secrets meant only for those brave enough to listen. Isabella felt small, yet alive in a way she never had among the velvet walls and candlelit ballrooms of Windermere. And each day, Tokuda's quiet strength, his unwavering presence, and the gentle authority in his gaze chipped away at the walls she had built around her heart. As the moon rose high, casting silver across the plain, Isabella realized that the journey her father had intended as punishment might be the very path toward freedom. She did not yet understand the full measure of Tokuda's heart, nor did she know how the story between them would unfold, but one thing became clear: her life as it had been was gone. What awaited her was uncertain, dangerous, and yet, for the first time, thrilling. And somewhere deep in her chest, a flicker of hope dared to ignite. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night sky. Isabella knew that the moment of reckoning, the moment where fear, pride, and desire would collide, was approaching. She glanced at Tokuda, whose eyes reflected the flames, strong and steady, felt the stirring of a question that could change everything. Could a woman, cast aside by her own blood, truly find love in the arms of a man she had been taught to fear? And more importantly, would that love survive the harsh truths of the world they now shared? The answers remained shrouded in the night, as uncertain as the wind that swept across the plains. But Isabella Thornfield, once confined by judgment and fear, had taken her first steps into a life that might just belong entirely to her hand, into the arms of a man whose love promised to challenge everything she had ever known. The days that followed were both harsh and mesmerizing. Isabella Thornfield awoke to the cries of hawks circling above and the rustle of wind through the tall grasses. The land felt alive in a way she had never known, a raw, unpolished vitality that both exhilarated and unnerved her. Tokuda moved through it as if born of it, each step sure, each gesture purposeful. Isabella tried to mirror him, attempting to understand the rhythm of a world so unlike the silken corridors of Windermere, but her movements were clumsy, her weight an ever-present reminder of the difference between her old life and this new one. Tokuda did not mock her. He watched with an unspoken patience, correcting her stance or motion with a gentle hand, a word here and there spoken softly but firmly. "The earth has memory," he said one morning, as Isabella struggled to follow him over a steep incline. "It knows who belongs and who does not. Listen, and it will teach you." His eyes, dark and unwavering, held a gravity that silenced her pride and fear alike. Isabella realized that here, survival demanded humility, but also courage, and the courage she had long buried beneath her father's expectations was slowly stirring again. As they traveled, Isabella learned of the Apache people in fragments through Tokuda's stories, its observations, and the quiet lessons of the land. He spoke little of his own past, revealing only enough to hint at a life rich with responsibility and honor. Isabella sensed that there were wounds beneath his calm exterior, secrets that weighed on him like stones in his chest. The knowledge both intrigued and frightened her, for she had never encountered a man so strong, yet so impenetrable. One afternoon, Tokuda stopped by a creek to fish for their meal. Isabella knelt at the water's edge, attempting to imitate his movements. She slipped, and the cold water surged around her knees, bringing a sharp gasp from her lips. Tokuda's hand shot out, steadying her. "Do not fear the fall," he said, eyes meeting hers. "It is how we learn where to place our feet next." The words, simple yet profound, lodged themselves in her heart. It was a lesson she could have never learned in a ballroom or under the scrutinizing gaze of her father. Even as she absorbed these lessons, the tension between past and present lingered. Memories of Windermere haunted her father's scornful voice, the judgmental stares of would-be suitors, and the gnawing awareness of her body that had always felt like a curse. At times, in the stillness of the night beside the fire, she questioned whether she belonged here at all, whether the world of the Apache would ever accept a woman born into a life of privilege, yet marked by rejection. Tokuda noticed these moments, though he did not press. Instead, he allowed silence to speak its own truths, and Isabella found herself talking more than she intended. She spoke of the estate, of her loneliness, of the way her father had treated her as though she were a mistake. Tokuda listened, never interrupting, his gaze steady, his presence a reassurance. And in those quiet exchanges, Isabella began to see a man who did not define her by the world's shallow standards, who measured worth by heart and spirit rather than size or lineage. Yet the land itself held dangers. Wolves prowled in the shadows, and rival tribes occasionally skirted the edges of Apache territory. Every day was a test of vigilance, of strength, of wit. Isabella had never experienced life like this. Her every movement mattered. Her every decision could alter the course of the day, even the survival of both herself and Tokuda. And still, she felt an exhilaration she had never known, a pulse of freedom in each risk, each challenge met. One evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, Tokuda led her to a cave nestled between jagged rocks. The wind howled, carrying the scent of rain and the distant wildfires that sometimes swept across the plains. Isabella shivered, not from the cold, but from the intensity of the unknown. Tokuda's hand on her shoulder steadied her, and in that moment, she realized she was no longer merely a passenger in this journey. She was a student of a world she had once feared. Inside the cave, the walls bore markings of generations past, symbols she did not understand but felt drawn to. Tokuda moved to a section and traced a pattern with his fingers. "These are the stories of my people," he said quietly. "They speak of battles fought, of lives lost, of love that endured despite impossible odds." Isabella's gaze followed the lines, and she felt a strange kinship with these echoes of courage. Perhaps she thought her own story had only just begun. Still, uncertainty gnawed at her. Could she ever reconcile the noblewoman she had been with, the woman she was becoming? Could she find a place in a culture so different from her own, without losing herself entirely? The questions were unrelenting, and each day brought new challenges that reminded her of how far she had been cast from the life she once knew. And then there was Tokuda himself, an enigma she could neither fully read nor resist. He treated her with respect, yet there were moments, a glance, a slight shift of posture, a gentle command that left her heart unsteady. She could not deny the stirrings of something dangerous yet thrilling, a pull toward a connection that defied everything she had been taught about propriety and desire. And though fear whispered that she should resist, something deeper, something raw and insistent, urged her to trust him. As they prepared for another day of travel, Isabella could not shake a creeping unease. Lord Thornfield's decision had set these events in motion, yet she felt the weight of his judgment still pressing upon her. Like an invisible chain she could not quite escape. What other punishments might fate or her father have in store? And what if Tokuda's patience was not infinite? What if his respect masked a judgment she could not yet perceive? The questions lingered, unresolved, and the vastness of the land offered no easy answers. The night was long, the wind fierce, and the fire between them flickered uncertainly. Isabella lay awake, listening to the cries of the wild and the slow, steady breathing of Tokuda. She felt the tension of the unknown pressing closer with each heartbeat. The lessons of the land were only beginning, and the mysteries of Tokuda's heart remained just out of reach. And yet, amidst the fear, there was a spark of hope, a fragile, daring possibility that her punishment could become a path to freedom and perhaps even to love. The storm broke, just as dawn crept across the horizon, lightning slicing the sky and rain hammering the plains. Tokuda moved with calm precision, preparing their small camp for the deluge, while Isabella struggled to keep her footing in the mud. Each moment was a test, each challenge a reminder of the harsh realities of this new life. And yet, despite the danger, the exhaustion, and the uncertainty, Isabella felt alive in a way she never had. She was no longer merely Isabella Thornfield. The rejected noblewoman she was a woman forging a new existence, a woman who might one day discover what it meant to be seen, truly seen, and perhaps even loved. But the horizon held shadows yet to be revealed. Forces from the past lingered, and the land carried secrets neither Isabella nor Dakota could yet fully understand. With each step, each trial, the story of the noblewoman and the Apache grew more entangled. The questions of loyalty, courage, and love loomed larger than ever. And in the distance, where the plains met the mountains, Isabella sensed that the true test of her spirit was only just beginning. The rains had eased, leaving the plains slick and glistening, reflecting the morning sun in blinding shards of light. Isabella Thornfield struggled to keep pace with Dakota as he led her through a narrow pass flanked by jagged rocks. Every step was precarious, and she felt the weight of both her body and the expectations that had been thrust upon her. Dakota moved ahead with effortless confidence, his eyes scanning the horizon for threats, yet he cast occasional glances back to ensure she followed. Isabella's heart raced not from exertion alone, but from the unspoken tension between them, a mixture of fear, awe, and curiosity she could not yet name. The journey had begun to reveal other challenges beyond the physical. Isabella had begun to notice signs of rival tribes encroaching on Apache lands. Dakota spoke little of them, only giving warnings that were measured and calm. But the unease beneath his calm surface was palpable. "Not all who roam these plains are friends," he said one evening, as they set camp near a cluster of scrub oaks. "You must learn to read the land, to know the difference between threat and shadow. Everything carries meaning if you are willing to see." Isabella nodded, trying to absorb both his words and the subtle movements that betrayed his tension. It was a world where instinct and observation mattered more than titles and wealth, and the lessons were unforgiving. Isabella's own struggles became more complicated. She had begun to feel the limitations of her old life in every movement, the tightness of muscles unused to endurance, the strain of climbing slopes and keeping balance across streams. Yet she also began to notice her own growing strength, the small victories of navigating the land, building fires and learning to hunt alongside Dakota. Each success was tinged with pride, yet also with doubt. Was she capable of truly belonging here, or was she merely surviving? One morning, as the sun rose over the plains, a distant column of dust caught Dakota's attention. He stiffened, hand resting lightly on the bough slung across his back. Isabella's pulse quickened. Dakota's eyes narrowed, and he moved with swift precision, signaling her to stay low. From their vantage point, they could see a small party of riders approaching, banners fluttering in the wind, their purpose unclear. Isabella felt a flicker of fear. Was this the law from her father's lands come to retrieve her, or were these hostile scouts from another tribe? Dakota did not speak immediately. He waited, observing the riders, analyzing their movements. "They carry authority," he murmured finally. "But not all authority is friend. We must remain cautious. Do not let your past dictate your actions here." Isabella realized that even within this vast, untamed land, echoes of her past, the rigid expectations, the control of her father, the judgment of strangers were never far behind. She felt a twinge of anger and resentment at her father, who had set her on this path, as well as fear for what might come. As the riders drew closer, the tension grew. Dakota moved with decisive stealth, guiding Isabella to a concealed vantage among the rocks. She felt her breath catch in her chest as the riders paused, scanning the land below. They dismounted briefly, tying their horses to nearby trees, their movements deliberate and cautious. Isabella noticed the insignia on their cloak symbols she did not recognize, but the authority in their bearing was unmistakable. The realization hit her. This land was not simply wild and untamed. It was contested, political, dangerous. Survival would demand not only strength but wisdom, and she had much to learn. Days later, as they pressed further into Apache territory, Isabella's thoughts returned often to her father and the life she had left behind. Lord Thornfield had cast her out as punishment, yet she suspected that the decision was never as simple as mere anger or pride. There had been whispers in the halls, subtle threats of alliances, negotiations, and debts owed. Perhaps her father had seen her rejection not as cruelty, but as strategy, using her as a pawn to settle scores he could not face himself. The thought made her blood run cold, but it also fueled a quiet resolve. She would not allow herself to be a pawn any longer. Dakota remained a constant presence beside her, both protector and guide, yet Isabella sensed an internal conflict within him as well. He was bound by honor to his people, yet he had taken her into his care, a noblewoman from a world that had wronged her. There were moments when his gaze lingered on her longer than necessary, subtle gestures of concern or patience that hinted at feelings he did not fully express. Isabella wondered what it would mean if those feelings were revealed, if the bond between them grew beyond the necessities of survival. The thought brought both warmth and apprehension. Would such a connection complicate matters, or offer her a chance at a life she had never dared imagine? Amidst the wilderness, Isabella also began to notice the small intricacies of Apache life. She watched Tokota's people with a mixture of awe and trepidation, observing their rituals, their skills in tracking and hunting, their unspoken codes of respect and loyalty. There was an elegance to their strength, a harmony with the land that contrasted sharply with the rigid order of Windermere, yet with beauty came danger. She witnessed disputes arise, sometimes simmering quietly, sometimes erupting in anger. Tokota often intervened with authority, but Isabella realized that even he was not immune to the challenges of leadership and protection. As they traveled through a dense grove one evening, Tokota suddenly halted. His eyes scanned the shadows, hand moving instinctively toward his bow. Isabella's pulse raced, and she followed his lead, crouching low. From the thicket, a figure emerged, Apache scout, alone, his expression tense. He spoke rapidly in their language, and Tokota listened intently, nodding occasionally. When he turned to Isabella, his expression was grave. "There is unrest," he said. "It's not all welcome strangers, and not all trust outsiders, even those I protect. We must be careful. Eyes are watching, and danger can come from those you least expect." The warning weighed heavily on Isabella. She'd hoped for a reprieve, a moment to breathe, but the reality of her new life was relentless. Danger was constant, and trust was a fragile commodity. She felt the enormity of what lay ahead, the lessons of survival, the trials of loyalty, the quiet struggle to understand Tokota and his world. She realized that each day brought a choice, to retreat into fear and old habits, or to embrace the uncertainty, the challenge, and perhaps the possibility of something greater. Night fell with a heavy sky, the wind rising in mournful gusts that rattled the sparse shelter they had made. Isabella sat close to Tokota, feeling both the comfort of his presence and the tension of unspoken truths. The firelight danced across his features, revealing strength and shadows alike, and she wondered what thoughts ran through his mind. Was he merely performing duty, or did he feel something deeper for her, something unacknowledged yet powerful? And if so, how could such a bond survive in a land filled with threats, old grudges, and the distant influence of a father who had already declared her expendable? Even in the silence, the world pressed upon them. Wolves howled in the distance, signaling that territory was contested. Rain threatened to fall again, turning the plains into a treacherous expanse. And beyond the natural dangers, Isabella sensed the invisible currents of human ambition, scouts, rival tribes, perhaps even emissaries from her father's estate. Every decision mattered, every misstep could be fatal, and yet the potential for growth, for understanding, and for unexpected connection lingered in the spaces between the storms. Isabella pressed her palms into the damp earth, drawing strength from the land even as it tested her. She realized that survival would demand more than obedience. It would demand courage, ingenuity, and the willingness to confront both her own limitations and the secrets of the man beside her. And as she gazed at Tokota, whose eyes never left the horizon, she felt the weight of their unspoken bond. The journey was far from over, the challenges only beginning, and the question of whether trust and love could truly exist in such a world remained unanswered. The plains stretched endlessly, each ridge and valley promising both danger and discovery. Isabella's thoughts flickered to the Windermere estate, to her father's judgment, to the society that had rejected her. And she knew that leaving that world behind was not a simple act, it was a trial, a test of everything she had ever believed about herself. Tokota's presence offered guidance, protection, and perhaps something more. Yet the shadow of uncertainty loomed, a reminder that this journey could demand sacrifices she had not yet imagined. And so, as the night deepened and the fire crackled low, Isabella Thornfield remained on the precipice of a life transformed. The challenges ahead were countless, the threats both natural and human ever present, and the questions of trust, loyalty, and love, unresolved. Yet beneath the fear, a spark of determination burned. She had been cast into this world as punishment, yet she sensed that it might also offer the chance to become someone stronger, someone wiser, someone who could survive, and perhaps even thrive in ways her father had never anticipated. The wind whispered through the tall grasses, carrying secrets of the plains, the cries of unseen predators, and the echo of possibilities yet to unfold. And Isabella, guided by Takoda's steady hand and her own growing resolve, felt the stirrings of a story that would test her spirit, challenge her heart, and lead her into the unknown. The wind had turned sharp and cold, cutting across the plains as Isabella Thornfield and Takoda pressed on through a narrow canyon. The sky was heavy with clouds, the promise of a storm echoing the tension that hung between them. Every step was cautious, every movement deliberate. Isabella had grown stronger, more aware, yet even she could feel the land testing her limits. Takoda moved ahead, his eyes scanning the horizon for threats she could not yet perceive. The silence between them was thick, unspoken words hanging in the air like smoke. The previous weeks had worn them both, their bodies and minds pushed to the edge. The rival tribes, the harshness of the wilderness, the weight of her father's judgment, all of it, pressed relentlessly upon Isabella. She could feel the land as Takoda did, sensing when the wind shifted, when predators lurked, when unseen eyes watched. Yet the greatest threat, she realized, might not come from the wilderness alone. It was the past and the secrets it carried that loomed over her like a shadow. One evening, as they made camp in a secluded hollow, Isabella noticed the tension in Takoda's movements. He did not speak much, his silence heavier than usual. When she asked if something troubled him, he simply shook his head, but his eyes betrayed concern. "The plains have eyes," he said finally. "Not all who roam them are bound by honor, and not all trust what they cannot control." Isabella shivered, understanding the gravity of his words. It was more than the land they were being watched, and someone, somewhere, had plans that might not include their safety. That night, sleep came fitfully. Isabella lay beneath the thin canvas of their shelter, listening to the sounds of the night wolves howling, wind rattling rocks, and the distant drumbeat of hooves. Her thoughts drifted to her father, to Lord Thornfield, and to the life she had been forced to abandon. Was he satisfied, thinking he had punished her beyond measure? Or was there something more, a motive yet hidden, pulling strings from afar? The questions gnawed at her as she drifted in and out of consciousness, each dream filled with shadows and whispers. The storm broke suddenly, lightning slicing the sky, rain hammering the earth with relentless force. Takoda moved quickly, gathering supplies, securing their camp, his voice calm but urgent. Isabella struggled to follow, her movements hampered by fatigue and the cold, but Takoda's steady presence guided her. "Not let fear dictate you," he shouted over the roar of the storm. "We survived together." His words, fierce and grounding, ignited a fire of determination within her. She would not be broken, not by the land, not by fear, and certainly not by the chains of her past. As dawn approached, the storm eased, leaving the plains glistening and treacherous. Takoda led her along a hidden path, one only known to those who moved with the land. Isabella followed, heart pounding, muscles screaming, yet she felt a strange exhilaration. Danger and survival had sharpened her senses, and for the first time in her life, she felt capable, attuned, alive. But the respite was short-lived. In the distance, she saw the dust rising again, another group of riders, this time larger, moving with purpose and speed. Takoda stiffened, signaling her to remain quiet. "They come for reasons I do not yet understand," he murmured. His gaze was fixed, calculating, every instinct on alert. Isabella's pulse raced. Was this a message from her father, a rival tribe, or someone else entirely? The unknown pressed down on her, heavier than the storm-soaked earth beneath her feet. The riders approached a narrow pass, their movement deliberate, their attention focused. Takoda led Isabella to a concealed ledge above, his hand steadying her. "Do not speak, do not move unnecessarily. We watch, we wait, and we choose the right moment." His calm authority was a tether, anchoring her racing thoughts. Isabella realized that every decision now mattered. The timing of movement, the smallest gesture, the choice to trust or to act. Failure could mean capture. harm, or worse. Hours passed and the tension mounted. Isabella's muscles ached, her mind raced with possibilities, and every snap of a branch or rustle of grass made her heart jump. Tekoda's patience never wavered, yet she could sense the strain beneath his composed exterior. Something was at stake beyond survival, an invisible battle of strategy and power, of trust and loyalty that neither of them could ignore. In the quiet moments, Isabella reflected on the bond that had formed between them. Tekoda's presence was no longer just guidance, it was a tether of safety and a spark of something deeper, something she had never allowed herself to hope for. She could see the strength in his eyes, the weight of responsibility he carried, and the subtle ways he protected her not only from the dangers of the land but from herself, from the doubts and fears that had plagued her since childhood. And yet, with every heartbeat, the tension of the unknown grew stronger. Suddenly, one of the riders raised a hand, signaling to the others. Tokoda's eyes narrowed, and he motioned for Isabella to move silently along the ledge. The horses shifted, the sound muffled by the earth, yet sharp enough to make her pulse quicken. Isabella's hands gripped the rocks, her knuckles white, as they navigated the narrow path above. Each step was a test of balance and courage, and every misstep could mean discovery. Her training, her strength, and her trust in Takoda were all being tested at once. As they reached a more secure vantage, Takoda finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "They seek someone or something," he said. "We do not yet know what, but we must be ready for action." "The plains do not forgive hesitation." Isabella nodded, swallowing hard. Her body trembled, partly from exhaustion, partly from fear, but mostly from the awareness that the most intense moments of their journey were arriving. Every instinct screamed that the confrontation, the true test of courage and trust, was imminent. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the plains. Isabella could feel the tension in the air, thick and electric, like the calm before a storm. Takoda crouched beside her, hand resting lightly on her shoulder, grounding her even as the danger pressed in. "Stay close," he whispered. "Do not let the past, or the fear of it, cloud your judgment. Trust the land, trust yourself, and trust me." The weight of his words settled on her, and for the first time, she realized that her survival depended not only on skill but on the bond between them, fragile and untested though it was. From the shadows below, the riders advanced, their movements now deliberate, their intent unmistakable. Isabella's heart raced, adrenaline flooding her veins. Every lesson, every trial, every moment of doubt and courage led to this point. She could feel the climax of their struggle approaching, a convergence of past and present, of fear and hope, of danger, and the fragile spark of trust between her and Takoda. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the riders' faces. The determination in their eyes, and the power of the moment. Isabella's breath caught, and Takoda's hand tightened briefly on hers. A silent acknowledgement that the moment of confrontation was near. The plains themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what choices would be made, what courage would be summoned, and what consequences would unfold. The wind shifted, carrying a scent of smoke and distant fire, a warning of forces beyond their immediate view. Isabella knew that the trials of the land, the hidden threats, and the shadows of her father's influence were all converging. And yet, beneath the fear, beneath the tension, there was a strange, undeniable exhilaration. She had survived storms, predators, and doubt. She had learned to move with the land, to think with clarity, to trust in Takoda and herself. And now, on the edge of what could be the most dangerous confrontation of her life, she realized that everything she had endured had led to this moment. Takoda's eyes met hers, dark and steady, a silent question and reassurance wrapped together. Isabella felt a flicker of determination, courage, and something more, something deeper that had begun to grow between them. The riders were close, their intentions unknown, the stakes higher than ever. The wind carried the scent of rain and danger, the plains stretched endlessly, and every instinct screamed that the climax was imminent. And in that charged silence, with the storm above and the shadows closing in below, Isabella Thornfield understood that the choice was hers as much as Tokoda's. Every lesson, every fear, every ounce of courage would be tested. The next moments would decide not only their survival, but the possibility of a bond that could transform her life. The plains held their breath, the wind whispered secrets, and the story teetered on the edge of a moment that could change everything. The first clash came with a sudden, shattering roar. The riders below, intent on capturing or harming them, surged forward through the canyon, their horses pounding the earth like thunder. Isabella's heart leaped into her throat, but she did not falter. Tokoda's hand was firm on her shoulder, guiding her with steady assurance. "Stay close, and trust your instincts," he commanded, voice low and urgent. The world narrowed to survival, every sound, every shadow, every movement magnified. Tokoda moved with precision, leading her along the jagged rocks where the riders could not follow easily. Isabella followed, muscles aching, lungs burning, yet every lesson learned from the land. Every instinct honed by days of hardship served her now. She ducked as a horse reared nearby, gripping Tokoda's arm to steady herself, and felt a strange thrill surge through her. She was no longer merely a noblewoman cast out by her father. She was a fighter, a survivor, a woman discovering her own power. The riders pressed on, their shouts echoing off the canyon walls. Tokoda paused at a narrow ledge, turning to face them with a quiet intensity that made Isabella's chest tighten. "We do not have to fight them all," he said, eyes scanning the canyon for advantage. "We use the land. We choose our moment," he gestured, and Isabella understood instantly. Recognizing the patterns of movement he had taught her, the way the earth itself could become a weapon and a shield. Lightning flashed, illuminating the canyon in stark relief, and Isabella caught sight of the riders' determined faces. Fear rose, but it was tempered by the fire of resolve burning within her. This was the moment she had trained for, the trial that would determine not only her survival, but the measure of the bond forming between her and Tokoda. She felt his strength beside her, not just physical, but moral, unwavering, a steady pulse anchoring her in the chaos. They descended carefully, rocks giving way beneath their feet, till they reached a narrow gorge where the riders' numbers could not overwhelm them. Tokoda positioned her behind a boulder, bow at the ready. Isabella's hands shook, but she remembered the lessons of the past weeks, the rhythm of the land, the sharpness of her own senses, the strength of the bond she now shared with Tokoda. Together they were a force, and even as danger pressed in from all sides, she felt a calm determination she had never known before. The first rider attempted to flank them, but Tokoda anticipated the movement. With swift, precise action, he incapacitated the threat without unnecessary harm. Isabella's pulse thundered, but she did not look away. She realized then that Tokoda's strength was not just in skill or bravery, but in restraint and honor, qualities that she had never associated with men of her old world. His presence beside her, unwavering and protective, emboldened her. She felt herself growing beyond fear, stepping into courage she had thought impossible. The confrontation reached its peak as the remaining riders regrouped, pressing forward with renewed determination. Tokoda's strategy, honed by instinct and knowledge of the land, gave them an advantage. Isabella moved with him, ducking, weaving, following the cues he had taught her, feeling a unity with him that went beyond words. Each moment of danger heightened the bond between them, and in the chaos, Isabella recognized a truth she had long denied. She trusted him, and in trusting him she found strength she had never known. The fight did not last long, though it felt eternal. Tokoda's calm authority, Isabella's newfound courage, and the advantages of the land itself allowed them to turn the tide. The riders, realizing they could not prevail, retreated, disappearing into the canyon with dust and echoes of frustration trailing behind them. Isabella sank to the ground, exhausted, but a fierce sense of triumph burned within her. They had survived, and in doing so, she had discovered a courage and resilience she had never imagined. As the adrenaline faded, Tokoda turned to her, eyes searching hers. "You have done well," he said softly, the compliment carrying weight and sincerity. Isabella felt warmth flood her chest. She realized that beyond the danger, beyond the trial, there was something else in acknowledgement, a recognition that her courage mattered, that she was no longer merely a noblewoman rejected for her size, but a woman of worth, strength, and heart. The following days were quieter, though still filled with vigilance. Isabella and Tokoda moved carefully through the land, now more confident, more attuned to each other and to their surroundings. The Apache people welcomed them with respect, impressed by Isabella's courage and determination. She learned new skills, understood new customs, and felt herself growing in ways she could not have imagined. Tokoda remained beside her, a constant guide, protector, and now something more, a companion, whose presence was as comforting as it was exhilarating. One evening, as they rested beside a calm river reflecting the orange glow of the setting sun, Isabella spoke quietly. "Tokoda, I do not know how to thank you, not just for protecting me, but for seeing me?" Her voice trembled, but there was sincerity in her tone, a vulnerability she had rarely allowed herself to reveal. Takeda's gaze softened, the hard edges of the warrior replaced by warmth and understanding. "You need no thanks," he said gently. "You have shown your own strength. That is more than enough." The days that followed brought small victories and quiet joys. Isabella began to embrace the life she had once feared, finding freedom in the land. In her abilities and in the bond she shared with Tokoda, she wrote letters in her mind to her father, though she did not send them, acknowledging the woman she had become. Lord Thornfield's judgment no longer held power over her spirit. It was the land, the trials, and Takeda's guidance that shaped her, and she felt a deep, abiding sense of accomplishment. At last, Isabella stood on a ridge overlooking the plains, the wind whipping through her hair, Tokoda at her side. She felt a peace she had never known, a clarity that only comes from confronting one's fears and embracing one's potential. "The world is vast," she said softly, "and I have learned that strength is not in what others think of you, but in what you know of yourself." Tokoda nodded, his expression thoughtful, proud, and filled with quiet affection. Their journey had transformed her in ways she could not have imagined. She had survived storms, rival tribes, and the cruelty of her past. She had discovered courage, resilience, and the power of trust. And she had found love, not the kind demanded by society or titles, but a profound, steady, enduring love that grew from respect, shared struggle, and understanding. Takeda's steady presence beside her was a promise, unspoken yet powerful, that they would face whatever the future held together. In the quiet moments, as the sun set behind the distant mountains and the plains glimmered with the last light of day, Isabella realized that her life had been transformed. What her father had intended as punishment had become her liberation. She had been rejected, cast aside, yet in that rejection she had found a strength and a love that no judgment could diminish. The world was hers now, wide and unbounded, filled with possibility, challenge, and the promise of joy. Tokoda placed a hand gently on hers, and she looked up, meeting his eyes. In that glance they understood each other completely. No words were needed. The plains stretched endlessly before them, a canvas for a life built on courage, trust, and love. Isabella smiled, a smile free of fear, judgment, or doubt, and felt the full measure of the journey she had endured. She was no longer the noblewoman defined by others' expectations. She was herself, strong, brave, and deeply loved. As night fell, the stars appeared like scattered diamonds across the dark sky. The wind whispered through the grasses, carrying the quiet secrets of the land, and Isabella felt a profound sense of belonging. She had faced the unknown, endured trials, discovered her strength, and found a love that transformed her life. The plains were no longer a place of danger, but a home. And with Tokoda by her side, she knew that every challenge yet to come could be met, and every joy yet to be discovered could be shared. The story of Isabella Thornfield, the noblewoman once rejected and cast into the wild, had reached its turning point. She had discovered courage in adversity, trust in companionship, and love where she least expected it. The trials had not ended, nor would they ever truly vanish, but she now faced them with wisdom, strength, and an unwavering heart. In the vast expanse of the plains, she had found herself, and in Tokoda, she had found the love that made survival not just possible, but extraordinary. And as the night deepened, with the stars above and the soft murmur of the river beside them, Isabella Thornfield knew one undeniable truth: life had given her a second chance, and she would embrace it fully, fiercely, and without fear.